Good morning. I will have to say I'm a little nervous after getting to know all you guys and knowing all your strengths. It is my honor to present at the 8th Annual Teachers Conference, and thank you to Friends for allowing me to do so. As Alex said, I do work with veterans in our area, and I've worked with them for the past probably as long as I've been teaching, but in the last 5 years with a group called Honoring Veterans Legacies, which is the logo on the lesson plan, and I'll discuss a little bit of that later. Having worked with veterans all these years, I've heard incredible stories. The story I'm telling you today, I did not get to hear in person, but every time I hear it, I get chills and tears flow. And you're going to get to hear this story from the mouth that I got to hear it from, and John's niece. For a minute, I want us to imagine that you are 20 years old and your task is to drive a Higgins boat, and you're heading to an island that you know will possibly be a killing ground. And as your boat nears the shore waters, obstacles that you or your leaders did not see coming are impacting your duty. You must let these men, much like yourself, young, nervous, off the boat. They are heading into deep water. Some sink, some drown. Others wade ashore only to be encountered with heavy resistance. You must leave them. It's your duty to do so because more troops need to be delivered. Do y'all have that picture? That's exactly what John Kuhn encountered and faced in November 1943 as U.S. forces, naval and marine, invaded the island of Tarawa. This is John after his trip to Hawaii. He was born on May the 1st, 1923 in Walling, Tennessee, and John was drafted into the Navy. As you know from the introduction, he was stationed in the Pacific and his duty was to drive Higgins boats. During his service, John prayed every day to the good Lord that if he could only survive, he would spend the rest of his life taking care of his mother and his father. And that's what he did. He never married, but he fulfilled his life with his dogs, his niece, who you will get to meet in the video, and hobbies like crocheting. Now, when I found that John found out that he crocheted, I was like, that is super cool. You don't get to hear that often. And but John had a hidden secret, and it was one of nightmares daily since 1943. A little background in order to understand what made John the center of my presentation and kind of to understand what he will endure in life is a little bit about the invasion of Tarawa, which is a part of the Gilbert Islands. And the Gilbert Islands were held by the British until Japan seized them in December of 1941. And they had a good strategic significance due to their location. So the United States military would do Operation Galvanic. It's the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, and it was undertaken to provide a stepping stone to the strategically located Japanese islands of the Marshall Islands and the Marianas Island chains. And it was the beginning of what we know as island hopping and the first major American offensive in the Central Pacific. There's a legacy of Tarawa. It was known as Bloody Tarawa. And as Alex mentioned, it precluded some of the things that are going to happen at D-Day. A historian that I studied under, Donald Miller, often called it the D-Day of the Pacific. And it was the most heavily defended island that we would invade by Allied forces in the Pacific, as you can see, Joseph Alexander stated. Before Tarawa, previous islands, and I found this interesting as I was doing my research prior to 43, most of the islands that we were taken were not as heavily defended and kind of easily fell. And this was quoted in the author, James Jones, who wrote From Here to Eternity, said it was much more easily, sometimes with no casualties at all, before we reached Tarawa. And just to give you kind of an idea of the island, it's going to be centered, this attack, on the principal kind of southwest corner called Bichio was the area we were going to invade. And at the time, The island was about 300 acres. It was less than 3 miles long and about 800, no broader than 800 yards at the widest point. And it really didn't contain any natural elevation higher than 10 feet above sea level. So going into this, there are two opposing views. The Japanese basically were very confident in their defended island, basically saying 1 million men cannot take Tarawa, or not basically saying, but saying 1 million men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. And just to tell you what they had on this small island is they had 100 pillboxes, seawalls, an extensive trench system for defensive movements, an airstrip supported by coastal guns, anti-aircraft guns, heavy and light machine guns, light tanks, and snipers. Beechio beaches were naturally ringed with shallow reefs, and they were covered with barbed wire and mines, and at least 4,500 defended the island. America, on the other hand, felt very confident in their invasion plan. Gentlemen, Admiral Howard Kingman said, "We will not neutralize Beechio, we will destroy it, we will liberate it." Why was America so confident? Is because they knew they were going to have a concentration of aerial and naval bombardment unsurpassed in history of modern warfare. They were going to absolutely destroy it before landing. We know how that goes sometimes. So obstacles were not just man-made here at Tarawa. Nature played a huge role in protecting the island, which served the Japanese as well. So you had the ocean side. And this is a little bit about the ocean side. The reef that fringed the island, as you can read, was wider than the island itself. And we kind of talked about the barbed wire entanglements and such. And so because of this, planners, including Major Julian Smith, who was commander of the 2nd Marine Division, planned to use the lagoon side of the island. And there were issues with the lagoon side. The planners, including Admiral Turner, who was the amphibious force commander, had based his information on the depth of water from hydrographic charts made during an American Navy expedition from 1841, as well as some current data that was provided by some Australians who had dived in the area and who had lived on this particular island. And this, along with looking at the time of day, the time of the year, the particular hour and such of this invasion, it was estimated that at least 5 feet of water would cover the reef, just enough for that to come in. But they were warned that this could be off by a foot, meaning 4 feet. And the planner of the landing decided, well, we'll just go with the higher estimate. And they went with the 5 foot, which was a decision that will prove to have some disastrous consequences. So in the drawing up this plan, of course, they're going to deliver troops to the island with Higgins boats. And although these are shallow draft, as we all know what a Higgins boat is, Smith, Major Julian Smith, had his concern, and it was always over the water depth covering the reef. And so he thought about LBTs, or alligators Amtraks, thinking that they could go from deeper water onto, of course, the beach, move across the reef a little better and onto dry land. And so he ordered more. At the beginning of the invasion, I think I'm recalling there were like 42 at his disposal. The day before the invasion, he gets 125, which is barely enough to transport the rifle companies to for the first 3 assaults. And so follow-up troops were then going to have to be delivered and approached using the Higgins boats for ammunition, supplies, and troop movements. Oops. So a little bit more, Colonel David Shoup, the assault forces commander, he will tell Time Life war correspondent Robert Sherrod en route to Tarawa that we'll either have to wade in with machine guns, maybe shooting at us, or the Amtraks will have to run a shuttle service between the beach and the end of the shelf. So on early D-Day morning, November 20th, even before the Marines reached the fringe of the reef, things started to fall apart. Debarking of the troops from the transports were delayed when ships were caught between some of the bombardment. Japanese putting them right in the middle of Japanese gunfire. And the carriers and battleships were working on different schedules. So as we know, some of this bombardment just did not materialize as it should. And some of the B-24s that were supposed to show up did not. So let's paint the picture. This is a quote that I read from Marine Private Newman Bard. They were knocking us boats out left and right. A tractor would get hit, stop, and burst into flames. With men jumping out like torches, our boat was stopped, and they were laying lead to us from a pillbox like holy hell. I grabbed my carbine and an ammunition box and stepped over a couple of fellas laying there and put my hand on the side so as to roll them over into the water. Only about a dozen out of the 25 went with me, and out of that 25, Bard had 2 others make it ashore with him. And so the Higgins boats following the alligators got stuck on the lagoon reef. Many ran aground, and this is where we come into that imagine, ask you at the beginning to do is, many of these guys were having to be let off early, jumping into deep water, neck deep water, waiting with bullets whizzing past them. We can kind of see that D-Day and Normandy happening here in the Pacific. Eventually, they had nothing left to land, and this is what John Kuhn lived with, was dropping these men off in conditions that he had promised them that he would come back and get them, that they would be safe, and that he was always there for them. He was not going to let his boys perish. He was going to take them home. And this is kind of the scene. When we imagine at the beginning of this, John lived with that image every day after November 1943. It just replayed in his mind every day. And as I told you, when you hear this story, when I first heard it, I had went to an event that Honoring Veteran Legacies were holding at the time. And they stood up to kind of tell what they did in the community. And when they told this story, it was just sent chills everywhere. And I thought, I really have to be a member of this group. And I can't tell it. I've tried to do it for my students and anybody else. I just cannot replicate that emotion. So I had our local television station film John's niece and Chris Batay, who is the co-founder of Honoring Veterans Legacies, to tell the story. Chris was actually with John in Hawaii when he found peace from this story and kind of confided in her, and they became friends for the remainder of his life, which was a very short 2 to 3 years. So I'm going to let her tell you, and his niece tell you a little bit.
There was something on TV about veterans going to Washington, D.C., and he seen it. He said, I would love to take that trip. I said, really? They had only one more flight to go, and that would be the last flight. Mm-hmm. And that's when my sister and my nephew reached out to Chris Beatty.
And so a couple days later, I got a call from a lady, and she said, I have an uncle, and he lives in Decatur, and he stares at the 4 walls, and he's just waiting to die. And he thinks he's the only World War II veteran left. He doesn't think there's anybody his age, and he won't tell us what he did in World War II, so will you come and talk to him? And I said, absolutely. So at that time, we only had the chick magnet, Sherwin Calendar, as part of our group. So I went to see John Kuhn, who became the 2nd member of our group. And I just went in there, held his hand, kind of knelt down in front of him and talked to him for a few minutes. And when I asked him what he did in World War II, he started telling me. And a lot of times they told them not to come home and burden their families. And so I might have been the only person who's asked outside of family. So when he began to tell me, those in the room, their jaw dropped. And it was just an incredible story. And one thing about John's countenance was that he was just very depressed looking. His eyes were always cast downward, his head was downward. You could tell he was just almost had a heavy burden sitting directly on his head and his shoulders. So he began to tell me what he did. And he was in the Navy, and he drove Higgins boats, and he was part of the invasion at Tarawa. And he was driving for the assault, some young Marines. It was the first time, I believe, that they had tried something different in the islands, and rather than attacking on the beach, they tried to come in from the lagoon side because they thought they would get an element of surprise. But they misjudged the tides, and a lot of them got hung up on coral reef, and the Japanese were just kind of pounding them. And there was a lot of chaos in those boats. And the Marines, who were just a tad bit younger than John, you know, and he felt like he was supposed to take care of them. They were screaming, "We're gonna die, we're gonna die." And he said, "You are not gonna die. You're not gonna die. I'm gonna get you on that beach, and then I'm gonna get you back, and I am gonna get you home." And so in his mind, that was what he committed to do. So when he approached the beach, he was hung up a little bit on a coral tide, and he let the ramp down, and it was a little too deep. And so some of them were attacked as soon as they hit the beach, and some of them drowned. And after the battle was over, he was tasked with burying the bodies on the beach. And he saw the faces of many of those men that were in his boat. And so he just felt this burden, and he looked at me, and it was the saddest face I've ever seen. He said, "I lied to them. I did not keep my commitment to them," and he started crying.
He went up and down the beach road and he found them. He found 4 of them. I can't remember how many he said, but he found them. And he had a special place away from the beach, because at the time they were burying them on the beach. He didn't want to do that. He wanted them away from the beach. So he took them up and further in the island, and he buried them there. He wrapped them up, and then he left them. He couldn't bring them home. From that point on, he couldn't imagine how he could keep his word. So he made his first trip, and he met a man, one of the veterans, and he crocheted. He was crocheting on the way. And when he came back, he was excited. He said that he enjoyed it, his time, but meeting this other veteran that crocheted was what he did. Now, he had talents, hidden talents that a lot of people didn't know, and then one of them was making quilts and crocheting. And that's back when they had the Depression. They grew up in the Depression. They didn't have anything, so they held on to everything. And so my grandmother taught every one of them how to sew and can and do everything to survive. So he had that survival spirit. So he came back, and he was talking about how he enjoyed meeting the veteran and everything, and then he crocheted, and he just went in there and said, "I got to get my crochet needles out." And he started crocheting, and he started making things. And that was the first time I seen him have any kind of spark of interest in anything, because he was always just kind of like locked away in his thoughts. And then went to the first meeting. He really didn't want to go, because I don't know if it was like he was fighting what he should or shouldn't, but he wanted. But when we first went to the first meeting, he enjoyed himself. And then the next time, "I don't want to go back." And then he did. And then he got hungry to go back, and he got to meeting all these wonderful men and women in the military. And they all had a common thing, and that was the love for life. Even though what they've been through, don't matter how many scars or battles or they've been through, they loved life. And he loved it to the fullest. He lived it to the fullest too.
The only thing that was going to bring him peace was keeping his commitment. So he told me he dreamed. He said, "I dream about it." And I said, "How often do you dream?" And he said, "Every single night." And I said, "For how long?" He said, "Over 70 years. And he said, "Every single night I dream about it." And you could tell he just looked like he had just been beat down. Life had just beat him down. And so in order to bring healing into his life, we wanted to take him on some trips. So we did take him to Washington, D.C. He did not want to go. His niece made him go. And there he met a volunteer who took care of him, and they became really, really good friends, and that was a healing connection. He was a fellow veteran, Vietnam veteran. And there was some healing. You could see a little bit of healing. But his heart's desire was to go back to Pearl Harbor. That was the closest he could get because you can't go to any of the islands. So we began to plan a trip to go to Pearl Harbor. You know, we pray, and I think Satan did everything he could to keep that man from going on that trip because he knew it was going to heal him. And he lost one of his favorite nephews. He got pneumonia 3 times. He was in and out of the hospital and rehab 3 times. He didn't think he could make it. And then at one point he looked at me and he said, "What do I have to do physically to be able to go?" And I said, "Well, you can be in a wheelchair pretty much all the time, but you've got to be able to stand up, support your own weight, and go up bus steps with assistance." And so he told his PT folks that, and he said, "I'm going," and he did. So the very first outing that we went to, the day after we got there, was to Punch Bowl Cemetery. And the head of Punch Bowl Cemetery was telling us about a program where they were exhuming bodies from the Pacific Islands and bringing them back, and he mentioned Tarawa. And I knew John couldn't hear him, and John was in a wheelchair kind of far away, so I said, will you say that to him? He can't hear you. I didn't tell him anything about John's service. And I've got pictures, you know, where he's sitting there talking to John, and he started telling John about this program of exhuming bodies from the Pacific Islands. And he mentioned Tarawa, and John's head popped up. And he said, "Where did you find the bodies?" And the man just kind of looked at him like it was a weird question. He said, "Well, it was kind of on the upper part of the island." John said, "Yes, that was the airport." You know, and the man was very surprised, and he said, "Were you there?" And he said, "Yes, I was there." He said, "What was left of the bodies?" And he said, "Well, just skeletal remains, of course, but they were wrapped." And John was like, "Yeah, in their ponchos. I wrapped them in their ponchos." And we were just all taken aback. We had chills, and everybody was really quiet. And John said, "I buried the bodies on the beach." And that man looked directly into his eyes, and only God could have known that these were the words John needed to hear. He said, "You buried the bodies on the beach? You can help us find them, and you can help us bring those boys home." And it was like a burden was lifted. He went to a map. He showed them. There was some communication afterwards, and he was a different person immediately. I've got pictures of before and after. The next morning, when they came down to the lobby, I looked at John and I said, "John, do you think this will help with your nightmares?" And he said, "Oh, I dreamed last night." And I was like, dang, you know? And he looked up at me with the biggest smile and he said, "But for the first time, it wasn't a nightmare." And John changed. He was lighter, he was happier, he started singing, he started telling jokes. And that was in May, and the following February, we lost him. And about 3 weeks later, they found the bodies on the beach. But when John died, he died singing. And his nieces said, "We've never heard him sing before." So what God did on that trip, I've seen him do on many trips for many veterans. It brings healing to people who are suffering. And we have what we have because of their suffering. And we could do a trip a month and still not take every veteran everywhere they need to go. When they go to a place that represents in their mind war and noise and confusion and pain, and they go back and that place is at peace, it changes the real that goes in their mind, and it brings them peace.
I never got to meet John. I wished I had. He had passed before I got involved. But when I got to thinking about the theme of this conference, Character is Destiny, I went ahead and put the presentation together, and I thought, I'm going to look up qualities of character, qualities of heroes. We love to call them heroes in our group. And so I thought a good way to kind of introduce this with students is to get to thinking, what is character? And how many of these could you check off that John had? And selfishness, not selfishness, I guess it should be shiftlessness. my my typo there. He definitely had that, right? He was consumed with doing for others, really more so than doing for himself. He had conviction. He was very strong in his beliefs to serve and to continue to remember those that he had to leave behind. Definitely had courage in what he did, and the fact that just being in battle and doing that. I mean, oh, guys, I should have provided tissues. I'm sorry. Courage, as they all did, right, going into battle. Strength, of course. I mean, think about it. He had to bury these guys that he made a promise to, had to leave them behind. Moral integrity, John lived with, and determination. You know, every night he dreamed about bringing them home. And I think when it got to that opportunity where he was given the chance to actually do it, you kind of saw in those pictures how John was like, oh, I'm going to go to this map. You know, all of a sudden he had this strength and determination to help this group bring his boys home. We could do all kinds of veterans with this character list, because all the ones that Alicia talked about yesterday and Alex talked about the first day all would fit into every one of these categories. But before I go on, if I have a little time, I want to share with you, Chris had mentioned in her video, Chick Magnet. And Chick Magnet's real name is Sherwin Collender. And when she did this for the news played this as well. Everybody knew who Chick Magnet was. Sherwin, or he loved to be called Chick Magnet, was at Pearl Harbor, and he was at D-Day. He was at both. And he was a very cheerful little man that carried a business card that actually said Chick Magnet. And on it, it said, been there, done that, winked at them, and they were all mine. And every time he would carry around these cards, and he would give them to all the ladies. And so when he would come to school, of course, he'd give it to every lady in the front office and through. And all the kids would ask, you know, what did you like most about being in the Navy? And he would say, the ladies. And he was, what did you like most about landing in Australia? Well, the ladies. It was always the ladies. But he was a real character. And the founder, the reason this group was found was to honor Chick Magnet, because he had such personality and such healing he needed to do in travel. So he went to Normandy several times, in Hawaii and everywhere else. And unfortunately, we lost him a year before last at 102. With honoring veterans' legacies, we are starting, and you guys, this is kind of where you kind of come in to play with us, is we are starting a database of telling veteran stories. And right now we are centered on our veterans in North Alabama. We do World War II. Of course, we're trying to get all those completed, and we're doing Korea and Vietnam. And so we have filmed them. And we're also using some videos from Memoirs of World War II, who allowed us to use theirs because they came to us to video. And we're creating a series of lesson plans that we're putting on a website that's not on there. It goes live in September. It's eternalsalute.org. Eternalsalute.org. It's on the logo as well, I think. It's Eternal Salute. We're actually working on that now. It's not though, in our website. It is Eternal Salute. And we are, so I'll explain a little bit of that later as we go through this website. So we're picking some of our lesson plan. We're picking some of our veterans and featuring them right now, World War II. So it'll be all World War II when it comes out. And so John's story, I think, needs to be told. I think it's a prime example of how these gentlemen were part of the greatest generation, how they endured and how they went on and survived. And as Alex said, kept living, even though they were very badly damaged. And so this lesson plan is really written for history, can be used for anything. I got to take a look at it. I haven't looked at it in a while. And so basically, we've given you a picture of John to show the class. John there happy before he sticks his tongue out in that lesson plan. And provided you also the biography of John Kuhn. And also there is a link to an article that one of the local newspapers wrote on John that's a little bit more detailed. And then this website here. Oh, here it is. Oh, look at me. And then a website that I found in a quick Google search. It's a Business Insider link, and it is a website that covers the battle. It also has a variety of pictures. I think I can go back to it and click on it, right? Down a little bit. Sorry, guys. And it kind of divides the battle up. It gives a map. It gives several pictures. And so I've done this with my kids before, and then I got John, and I thought, oh, I'm going to just create this one huge lesson plan. You also have an activity sheet. And so the first basic lesson is to just get students to go to this website and just read it's very short in its description, and look at the photographs. I'm a big believer in using photographs in teaching. I think you learn so much from those. And so as you can see in the lesson plan, students will choose 3 photos from the article, make sure they get a little varied, and they kind of answer some questions on the worksheet that's provided or the handout that's provided about analyzing the photographs, stop, discuss what they see, trying to see what they learn. And after this, they're going to really look at, why do you think these photographs help you understand John's story a little better? And then, of course, this allows you to the opportunity to bring in the battle and talk about it. Around 1,000 American soldiers died in this particular battle, and that many had not returned home. And there is a photo gallery in the National World War II Memorial that you can go through as well. And it's talking about memorials of telling a sacrifice. And so the culminating activity with this particular lesson plan is to create a memorial for Tarawa that John would be pleased to have. That's so important to me, is for students to understand what memorials are and how to read those, and not just as, this is some boring place my parents make me visit, but to understand what's behind them. To continue on with this, if I may, anybody have any questions about John or the battle? Oh, all right, let me look at this, because I cannot remember. I think it was 2018. Not 10. He did not. Yeah, he didn't. As Chris says in the video, I want to say it was. I know it was before COVID. So I'm saying they went on that trip in 2018. I think he passed in 2019. Yes. So anything else? We move on about John. Yes.
Like, did he crochet for other veterans too? Like, or do you know, like, any of his crochet work is
No.
out anywhere?
His niece has a ton of it. Yeah, and some of his quilts. Now Chick Magnet did. He made little scrubbies that he gave out to everybody. When he passed, everybody that knew him got a scrubby. But John, it was just like she said, that was a way of teaching him how to have life skills, was how to sew. And I thought it was funny that he's on that airplane with another veteran who's also crochets. So who would have guessed crocheting was a veteran hobby? But yeah, she has a lot of his things. Chris, of course, being the founder, she gets a lot of our veterans when they pass. She gets a lot of things because she does a lot of things for them. She gets to inherit a lot of really cool things. Anything else? Going back to this honoring veterans' legacies, is we are actually looking to develop a teacher ambassador program, and are looking for people interested in writing lesson plans for us to add to this. And I told Chris I would love to have some teachers from around the country instead of those just in our area. And so we will send you video, and it can be math, science, could be any kind of. We're doing all core subjects. We have right now about 9 math and science lessons that tie into our veterans, PE, health. And we do have a stipend that goes with that. If anybody is interested, email me, and we'll hook you up to write those lesson plans for us and be a part of us. Who better to do that than a bunch of teachers who are willing to, travel in the summer to learn more about World War II. I'm a fast talker, and I feel like I finished so early. Is there anything I can entertain you with? Rachel?
Do you know why
can't visit the War Islands. You want to know why you cannot? Yeah, I don't know. Alex, do you know why those islands would be off limits for veterans to visit? I know they can go to Iwo Jima, right?
Iwo Jima right now, one day.
Yeah.
I don't know why they're off limits.
Yeah.
Maybe for security reasons or.
That they are,
They get to.
or just travel, the cost of travel.
That Rawlings airport
Yeah.
being able to land, I mean, it's so small.
Yeah.
Is that with modern aircraft, you solid.
Yeah.
Land.
Yeah, I assume it's some kind of travel thing. The trip that Chris just took 3 veterans to Normandy for, we actually took 3 Pacific veterans. She is a firm believer that all veterans need to go to Normandy to be honored because they cannot get that. Like 3 of the men we took, one of them is Mr. Otis Brandon. We have a lesson on him. He was in the Marines. He was in the Philippines. The other, Mr. Pat Patterson, was actually on a ship in Tokyo Bay and got to see the signing of the surrender of war. And he told me in a recent interview that he looked at all of that through binoculars, and he says somehow those binoculars found their way in my suitcase, and I still have them. And I said, "Did you steal those binoculars?" And he said, "Yeah, I still owe." I owe the government some money for those binoculars. And the other gentleman was actually in the tail end of the war. He was a Black gentleman, and he was a cook as they kind of rebuilt the area, and he went on to serve in Korea as well. And so he was the only one that really had served in Europe, but of course not during battle time. And so we took all 3 of them. We worked to fund for them to go. And she is a firm believer that Korean and Vietnam veterans need to go as well, even though it wasn't their war, because she thinks they all need to see how, and I know you can contest to that they are treated like royalty and that they all deserve that. So it's a blessing to get to work with this group. When I started with them, we had maybe 17 veterans, World War II veterans. We are down now to those 3. Before, actually, Howard just didn't get to go on the trip. So we're down to 4 out of that 17, 20 that we started with a few years back. So they all have great, awesome stories that would fit in any of this character is Destiny, but to me, John just has a happy ending to his story. Even though he didn't get to see how many returned, he did feel that peace and getting to point out where he buried those men. And I spoke to Chris last night before I did this to make sure I didn't leave anything out. And John buried some men on the beach, but he also had taken some men and buried them up off the beach, as his niece said, in there to keep, because he thought, they could get washed away. And so he did bury a few more up higher, which may be even more that they brought home that he actually did get to bury.
Yeah, you're a teacher too, right?
Yes.
Strategies, and I don't like to use that word, but I will. But in terms of getting out these stories, and I think some of the uglier side of it is part of the reason it resonates with kids and what they got through. What's your strategy to get that information out in the story? How did you, when you interview veterans, World War II, whatever, how do you get to the stuff that you think is important? I mean, I don't mean it's a strategy, but do that.
Yeah. And Alex being a journalist, I think the very first question to ask when I go interview these stories is, tell me your story. Let them talk first. And because they will. All those willing to sit down with you they will talk. And they'll talk for a long time. And then you can kind of pinpoint what you want them to kind of tell you. Now, this didn't work. I'll be honest with you. I tried that strategy. I was interviewing the 3 that went to Normandy for a local article I was writing. And when I asked them, what did you get out of this trip? 2 very funny responses. One was, oh, they're clean people over there. They didn't have stupid stuff in their yards. And Otis said, I was on my way driving over here. And can you believe someone, and this is so Alabama, I hate to say it, had a toilet in their yard? And I was like, yeah, I believe it. But they don't do that over there. And so Arthur looks at me and he said, we're getting roundabouts in our area, taking out the four-way stops. And he goes, and they know how to drive roundabouts. And I was like, that's not really what I want. I can't really print that Alabama people are nasty. So you kind of have to just listen to what they say first and then just say, well, can you tell me a little bit more about that? I don't understand that. We actually have Chris on here is actually interviewing our veterans now. So she is really good about pulling very things about them. She's a military. Her husband was career military and her parents were. So she's can talk some of that language that I cannot. Will say this though. I have used my students interview Vietnam veterans every year and we put it on a website. We use the Library of Congress questions. That way they're very streamlined and they're not asking things that, might upset them. I handle them a little bit differently than, of course, we do our World War II veterans. So does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
The video that you shared with us today, is it available on the website?
It is not just yet. I think it's embedded in this. So.
It's not in the Dropbox. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So yes, absolutely. But we haven't put it on. We haven't put this lesson on John because he went with another group. We're having to work out some things with that. So,
Say where you post your kids Vietnam.
voicesofservice.org. And how many of you guys do bring in veterans? Bring in veterans to talk with your kids? Yeah, I had did that this year, and I had a student tell me that, can they come back tomorrow? And then she said, best history class ever. We don't need you, just let them come. So, it's, but that's always a great experience. And like I said, to use those Library of Congress interviewing questions really works well. That way they do not ask anything that, as I mentioned, that can set some things off.
Point out, especially because I think it is important to bring veterans in the classroom when you can, but obviously we're losing our role as the veterans. And that's why it's so important what you all are doing. You're becoming their voice and you're their storyteller. So thank you all.
Thank you. I know this whole project we're doing really started from a veteran named Harold McMurrin. Mr. McMurrin landed at Omaha on D-Day and we lost him Christmas Day. But when we would talk with him, we're like, what do you want people to know and remember you by? He said, I just want my story to always be told. I just want someone to always know and appreciate what we did. Not me, but everyone else and the generation. So that's why we started this filming and putting in lesson plans and doing it across core because anytime you can fit a story in, even if it's a quick math lesson or a quick PE lesson, that's what they want. They want to be, they don't want to be recognized because what they did was normal. It was what anybody would do at their time. But I think they do want their voices heard. And so this is how it started. But Mr. McMurrin, a little bit about him. He was who I was going to honor tomorrow. Unfortunately, I can't, I have to have an early plane flight. But Harold was 98 years old and he still worked 40 hours a week on airplanes. And he suffered a broken arm. He had an auto accident where he actually pulled out in front of a motorcycle and the gentleman passed. And so that kind of slowed him down a little bit. And so his daughter came to take him back to Arkansas, and he did not want to go. Oh, he was so hell-bent on not going. But his wife had suffered a stroke years ago, and he was her primary caretaker. He washed her hair. He curled her hair, anything Miss Ruth wanted. And he always told me, Erin, if Miss Ruth passes, I'm right behind her. I'm right behind her. And she passed Christmas morning at 6 a.m. He passed at 12 that same day, 6 hours later. So we were kind of angry at him a little bit. There was nothing wrong with you. Why did you leave us? But I told Chris, what a love story. That's an amazing love story that he could not live without her. But thank you so much for, yes, Joe.
Was John a boat driver in any other landing, or is that the only?
This is the only one we ever talked about with Chris. So we do not know. Yeah. Well, thank you for indulging me today. I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed jotting the course.
Well, I feel like I'm home. Because when I got here in 2017, and they, Holly said, no, you need to go back to your school and do a community service project. It just, like those little things that your kid put in the tub and they balloon. That's what happened with this project. So today we want to do three things. One, we want to give you some tools that you can use in your classroom every day, not just for your project, but different things you can use every day. Two, we want to jumpstart you into thinking about what you want to do for your community service project, because you're all charged with doing that when you go back to your schools. And the third thing is we want to give you just sort of an overview of what we've done, and maybe you want to implement a piece of that or all of it into your classrooms.
So today we're going to use something called Pear Deck, which is the piece of giving you something you can use in your classroom every day. So if you have a device for me, cell phone works just fine, or you can use if you have your computer. But the website is called joinpd.com. So you can see it on my screen right here, and I'll read you the letters. It's a 6-letter join code. And the letters today are P, D, B, O, U, V. And it gives you a little mnemonic. Purple drums bravely officiate underwhelmed violas. And the kids like to see every day what the silly thing it's going to come up with is. Joinpd.com. Com. C-O-M. And then it is P, D, B, O, U, V. Yeah, that's your join-in code. And when we taught virtually or hybrid, it also says give students a link, and you can put that link in the chat box for kids. Yeah, so it asks you to sign into your Google if you have a Gmail account. That way, because I'll show you at the end, you can actually send this to your kids. It stays in their Google Drive as their notes for the day. So that way they're not trying to take notes while they follow along with your daily slides or whatever. The Wi-Fi is, Memorial Guest, all lowercase, and it is on the Guest Women's Memorial Network. And so what I'm going to do on my screen is I can go where it says Open Teacher Dashboard. And so this is what you'll do in your classrooms. And that way I can actually see all of your responses in real time. I can see who's in my class. So if I have 19 kids in my Pear Deck, but I know I have 20 in the room, I'm going to call them out and say, hey, Timmy, join your Pear Deck, because we give them a daily participation grade for participating. And not all of them are like true questions and things like that, but to make sure they're following along with the presentation, because we control what slide the kids see and all of those kind of things.
So during COVID, I used Pear Deck every day because that gives the kids a class participation grade. So I don't know about y'all, but I had students who would log in and go to Chick-fil-A. And they'd be like, I logged in. Why did I get a 0? Well, because you weren't there. You didn't do any class participation. And so you can actually do a printout at the end of the class, and you have it in black and white, what the kid answered and at what time they answered and the whole thing. So I, even though we're not virtual anymore, I use it in my classroom every day to be like, hey, Timmy, yeah, you were in class, but maybe you were watching YouTube when we were doing the lesson and you didn't answer the Pear Deck question. So that's your class participation grade. So, I mean, I even had kids tell me, Miss Morrison, I really have to pay attention in your class because I don't want to get a 0 on the Pear Deck. I'm like, yeah, you do. So, and I don't think we need any more introduction, do we?
No, you know us.
So here's your first Pear Deck slide. So this is for you to give a response. Do you have a personal connection to the greatest generation? And I know we talked about this the first day, but
And everything we're doing on Pear Deck is free, except if there's a slide where the kids draw on the screen, that's with the paid version, as well as I said, it's called takeaways at the end, where I send you your responses. Not everybody else's, just yours. That's part of the premium, and her school pays for the premium. My school does not. But everything else, the multiple choice, the response you're doing right now, and we're going to do a drag and drop, those are all the free version.
and so we can see each of you and what you're answering. But if we click show responses, we can show it up here and it doesn't have a name attached to it. So like I can't, you know, he can't see, Mark can't see what you wrote, Alicia. But I can see what Alicia wrote.
But if I really like Alicia's, I can star it and put it at the top of the screen anonymously.
Right. So kids are more likely to answer freely if they know that everybody else, I can say what I want to say, but everybody else doesn't know what I said, that it was me that said that.
Right.
So it's a really good tool for them to get more engaged and feel freely of speaking without being embarrassed, maybe. And
I can comment as the teacher directly to each of you in a direct feedback. And so one thing I did, especially during COVID, but I do it every day, is when my kids come in, before the bell rings, they should already have their warm up on Pear Deck. The first slide, if you make it the warm up, they can interact with it as soon as they log in. And so then I'll go through and like at Thanksgiving time, they get a turkey emoji when I'm happy with their response, you know, Christmas time, a tree, whatever. And so, but I don't say anything and they know their feedback is coming, but they're like, oh, I got the turkey. Oh, I got the Christmas tree. Oh, she did Santa. And so they're motivated to get that feedback, even though it's something silly and quick, just as that daily incentive. And obviously it's a grade.
okay. This is our next Pear Deck. So we want you to drag the icon to where you're from, and you can see our
You can
emoji.
see.
All right,
that's
there.
her, and then that's me, where we live.
And so again, they're not always right or wrong answers, but it gets the kids.
And so again, I can see, and on the teacher view, there's options. So right now, this is the layered view where I can see everybody's house on one screen, and I can click the individual view where then I would just see Alicia's screen with her house, and then I can scroll up and see each person's.
Now, can you put it so all the kids can see, or like all of us can see that?
Yes. Yes.
It's just
right now we're using two different computers, so no.
Right.
But typically in a class where we're using that one, yes.
It would be up there.
Yeah. All right. So now we're curious as to how you currently incorporate World War II into your classrooms. And we know we've already talked about this a little bit, but we just kind of want to know, like, project-based, you just do notes on it. Do you, like Erin was talking about, actually bring in World War II vets to your kids? Yeah, a lot of speakers. That's fabulous. An elective. Oh my gosh, we're so jealous.
To teach an elective World War II class is a dream. That would be so fun.
Yeah, Joe, virtual field trips. That's a really good point. For a lot of different places that it's not feasible economically, and things like that. Oh, okay. Sorry.
So Heidi, you can do field trips to Japanese internment sites. That's
Oh my
awesome.
goodness. Yeah.
It's not a reach for us to go to DC,
Right.
but if you live out west, it would be a reach for you to go to DC, but we can't go to the internment sites. So it's a trade-off as to where you live.
So we bring kids every year up here, and you'll see more about it through the project. But we bring kids up here every year to the Friends to the World War II Memorial, and to the National Mall, to each of the memorials. And then we spend the rest of the day at the Smithsonian of American History. And the kids love it.
Okay, another tool that we want you guys to be familiar with is called Edpuzzle. Who uses Edpuzzle? Okay.
Who's heard of Edpuzzle and is like, I don't want to learn something new?
Okay.
It's okay.
That's all right. Honestly, Pear Deck and Edpuzzle can change your life as
For
a
real.
teacher. They really can. Edpuzzle. So I put up these two. This is a video about the Greatest Generation.
And so this shows you right here that all we did was search in Edpuzzle's database. Other teachers have made this for you. It's completely free. All you have to do, you can preview the video, you can preview the questions. This shows you where in the video the questions are. This tells me what kind. These are all multiple choice. There's also an option for open-ended questions where the kids type something. And then up here is an example of what that question is going to look like. And then this is what the screen looks like once the kids answer. And obviously it'll be red if they get it wrong, and it'll actually give an explanation as to why it's wrong.
So Edpuzzle, you can, anything that's on YouTube, you can make an Edpuzzle questions for. And so the nice part is if you make them all multiple choice questions, it grades it for you. So if you do open-ended, you have to go in and grade those open-ended questions.
And it'll integrate through your LMS. If you have Canvas, if you have Google Classroom, Schoology, Blackboard, it integrates for you. And then if you have the integration between your LMS and PowerSchool, you don't have to do anything except click sync.
But the great, okay.
It both great with Google Classroom because we can send it off to the kids and then it just automatically, make sure you change the points in it because everything's out of 100 here. So
Right.
out of 10, you want to make sure Google Classroom says out of 10. But yeah, it takes very nicely with Google Classroom.
Do you know if it's compatible? We use Canvas.
Yes,
We use Canvas.
yeah, we use Canvas too. And we can show you how to do it if you want us to show you,
Yeah.
because it's super easy. And like you can take any bit, like you can Google, you can search in there what's already done, or you can upload your own YouTube video that you find. But like if I don't like this thing that is 12 minutes long, I can cut it down. I can edit it.
If I want to edit somebody else's questions and not just start from scratch, I can do that.
And you can share that with anybody in your school. So you see how it says community, that's everywhere, and then my school. So the other US history teacher from my school, all he has to do is look in my stuff and he can find that.
And we're at completely different districts and we make Edpuzzles for each other.
So if you want more information about how to use Edpuzzle, and another good thing too is you can assign this to the kids, or you can do it live as a class. And so, you know, at each question you can stop and have a discussion and then, you know, make sure everybody answers and then move on as a class.
And the cool thing about Edpuzzle is the kids cannot skip ahead. Okay. And this, from this space to this space, I don't have a question and I'm 16 years old and I don't want to watch this 30-second clip. Too bad. It will not let them skip. And if you don't have a question at the end, so like if your last question is here and there's still a minute left and the kids close out after they finish their questions, but not the video, it tells the teacher that. So that's a really cool thing too. It's easier just to put a question at the end. That way it forces them to do the whole thing. But if not, again, it'll say Joe only watched 60% of the video or whatever.
Right. And it's time stamped. And if a kid says, oh, I did that, I'll say, look, honey, in black and white, it says you never even opened it. Okay. So try again. And the other thing is if like I have students that are like really, you know, they want a really good grade. So they miss question number 2. They'll come and say, hey, Miss Morrison, can you reset that for me? So I can go back and make sure I get that question right. So the ones that really care, they self-advocate and want to make sure they go back and get that question right that they missed.
And they'll have to rewatch the whole video to do that, which we're all in favor of.
Right. So
go ahead.
I don't know the answer to the question. It says rewatch section.
Yes,
So
exactly.
they can rewatch the section even before they answer the question to make sure if they missed it. Because I have noticed, and sorry, but sometimes the question is like 25 seconds afterwards, so sometimes I have to play with where the
Mhm.
question is located in the video,
Right,
but
Right.
they can go back and watch it again before they answer the question. if they want to.
And they'll advocate for that too, even if you do a live in class. They'll be like, no, 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 go back. We need to rewatch. Which again is really cool.
And that's the other thing is, I know we are all crunched for time, and everything, but just don't blindly get somebody else an assignment. Make sure you watch it and make sure you know what the questions are and make sure that they're right in the right space and appropriate and all that stuff. And I know that, that's a teacher thing, like, oh, I found this, let me assign it 20 minutes from now. But just make sure you looked at it and looked at the questions and all that beforehand. But if you have any questions about Edpuzzle, we can certainly help you. And like I say, it is a game changer and the kids really like it too. And my kids, they work at their own pace. And so, this kid over here is doing an Edpuzzle. This kid over here is doing a web quest. So as long as in that 2-week period of a unit that they get their stuff done, they like that voice and choice that they can work at their own pace and do what they want to do that day.
So the second half of our standard and honors classes every day, the first half, we lecture and go through notes, do a whole class activity. The second half of class, they get that time to what we say, work on your unit activities, whether that's an Edpuzzle, whether that's vocab or a web quest. So that's what she's speaking to there. But then also, I just want to say real quick about Pear Deck that, again, it does integrate into Canvas really well. You can assign this as homework too, and have the kids answer your Pear Deck questions and look through your slides as homework. And again, that gives it to you to grade.
I'm sorry.
What is happening?
I don't know.
Okay. And then it integrates into either your PowerPoints or your Google Slides. All you have to do, you don't have to make anything brand new. If you already teach through either PowerPoints or Google Slides, all you have to do is say, add a Pear Deck question here, add a draggable on this map that I already have in my slides, which is really nice. Because again, we're not reinventing the wheel here.
And I have like, here's Abraham Lincoln without a beard, draw him one. That's a Pear Deck. Like, come on, y'all. So, yes.
Yeah. About the free version of Pear Deck. Does it now allow you to see the individual students? Because in the past it was only anonymous.
So yeah, it is still anonymous. And so what you can do with that is on your warm-up slide, make them put their name, and then that way you can track through with their name. But yeah.
Yeah, at any point, if you have questions, stop us. Because again, we're teachers, we're used to being
right.
So it's all good. It's all good. So we want to talk a little bit about veterans projects. And again, in 2017, when I came here and they said, Holly said, you've got to do a community service project. I had a 3.5-hour train ride home and the veterans project was born. Like when they picked me up from the train station, my family, I was like, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. My husband's like, calm down, girl. And so if you look at the thing that was in our folders, this right here is part of the Pocosin Veterans Project. So my first thought was, we're going to bring veterans in and interview them like Aaron does. And then I thought, well, we could have them do a coin toss at a football game. Oh, we could have a Christmas party. We can take them to a Peninsula Pilots game and they can throw out the first pitch, which is a semi-pro team in our area. We can take them fishing on the James River Pier. And so it just sort of morphed into this thing that the kids and the veterans are like buddies all year long. And then we have veterans that want to do it year after year. So we have what we call the profile of a Virginia graduate, which is.
So there's a piece of it. There's 4 pieces like content knowledge, workplace readiness skills. But the piece we focus on, besides the content knowledge, obviously, of the history, would be its civic engagement and community responsibility. And so what that means is, get your head out of your phone, 16-year-olds. All right. Our kids, we've talked about this all week, but we really work hard to teach our kids sacrifice and that civic engagement piece of talking to older people in the grocery store, and being that piece in their community, being part of their community rather than just kind of being in it if that makes sense.
And we are, both are very, strict teachers, and our students do what we tell them to do. And so on interview day, like these kids,
so here's some
they've
pictures.
never talked to older people.
There you go.
And so this is interview day at both our schools. And if you see that, we actually, the veteran gets to pick what they want on their shirt. So the number on their shirt is a number that is special to them. So like I have a guy who was like, well, I got out of the military in 1977, so I want 77. Another guy says, well, I have 3 grandchildren, so I want number 3 to be
we
my
make them
jersey number.
ourselves.
So we make the jerseys ourselves.
We buy, in the first year of both our projects, we bought them. But now we have grants and things like that. But we buy t-shirts, and we both have Crickets, if you're familiar with, it's a vinyl cutter essentially. And so, yeah, we make, and our kids made the logos. We have a great marketing program at Goochland High, and those marketing kids, run by a veteran's wife, one of my veterans' wives, made the shirts. And so they make the logo, and it says PHS or GHS Veterans Project on the shirts. And then on the back, yeah, it has their last name like a sports jersey, and then whatever number they choose. And the kids participate in helping me make the shirts. And then on interview day, the kids just pick a shirt, and the group of kids hold up the shirt, and the veteran comes to them to find their last name. And that's how they kind of get randomly paired.
And so the morning of interview day is always fun because the kids are like, I don't know what to do. Like, and I'm like, y'all, just talk to them. And the first thing I say, greet them, shake their hand, tell them you're happy to see them, ask them if they would like something to drink. And we, like Aaron, we use the Library of Congress veteran interview questions, because again, that's a great place for the kids to start. And so then by the end of the day, and of course they have lunch together. This year, Mission Barbecue actually came and catered my veterans lunch for free. And we'll talk more about community partners in a minute. But by the end of the day, the kids and the veterans are like BFFs. Like the veterans don't want to leave, and the kids don't want to go back to class. They want to sit there and talk to their veterans. And then, I've had veterans that, World War II veteran, Mr. Orndorff, actually in this picture, he did not graduate from high school. He joined the military when he was 16, and he didn't get to graduate from high school. He came back and tried to go to high school, and they said, no, you're too old. You can't go to high school. So his girls took that to heart. They had a bake sale and raised money to buy him a legacy brick that goes outside of our school with his name on it, engraved on it, and said that he was a PHS, veteran and all that stuff. So he had something out of high school that meant something to him. So these kids really end up loving their veterans. They spend time together outside of school. I had one women veteran who I walked into a volley game one night, and I'm like, why is Sam singing with the choir? Like, they didn't tell me, but their veteran, Sam Kukic, she was a Vietnam veteran, and she was like, I was in course in high school. And so the girls were like, oh, we're in course, so come practice with us and sing the national anthem with us at a volleyball game. They didn't tell me. I just happened to walk in the volleyball game, and there she was. So the kids really Sam took her girls to like a pottery craft thing, a paint night. And so they really get to be friends with each other outside of class.
Absolutely. Mr. Wadle right there. So he had the biggest group on interview day. He had like 8 kids, and look at those kids. They're mesmerized. He is hysterical. He's a Vietnam vet from the Marines. And he is just so captivating to those kids. I had to pry them apart. We set aside 4 hours, and he was like, no. And the kids were like, we're not going back to class, Miss Tate. I'm like, okay. So we had to clear out the cafeteria after my interview day. And so they went to the library, and I had like 4 other veterans who stayed with their kids all day until the end of the day at 3:45. I was like, y'all have to go home, children. And so that weekend, he went golfing with those boys. They have a poker club. They came and set up at our Christmas party, our Veterans Project Christmas party. The boys brought all these poker chips and cards and stuff. I was like, what are y'all doing? Y'all, we're having a Christmas party. They're like, oh no, we've already talked to Mr. Wadle about it. And he's bringing more of his Marine friends so we can play poker. I was like, okay.
And she got fired for gambling at school.
Right. And so I mean, like they had half the library by the end of my Christmas party playing poker. And my superintendent walked in. I was like, oh gosh, this is great. But just the connections they form. Thank you. All right. And we talk about as history teachers, primary sources. Our veterans, not only are they primary sources, but all the stuff they bring to show the kids love it. And the kids ask for us. We've gone to the copiers in school and made copies of all these maps and these pictures so our kids can keep them too. I have another picture, it may be throughout, but one of my veterans brought like his whole case of medals to show the kids and explain like how he got each one. And like this group, at the end of interview day, you know, we gave them, and you can see right there under Luke's arm, that they have that Library of Congress veteran sheet. And every single one of those kids goes, Miss Tate, our sheet is completely empty. Are we going to get in trouble? We talked to him and I can tell you all these stories he told me about this and something about a parrot that I can't repeat and he should not have told these kids and all of these things. And I'm like, no, that's totally okay. And about half of my kids could tell me everything and they wrote about it later for a class project. But they didn't even touch those sheets because they're so enthralled by their veterans, which is amazing.
This is something that I do cross-curricular that my kids write because they have a hero section in their English class. So they write the paper in the English class. So the English teacher and I work together. You had a question.
I did. How do you find these veterans?
Facebook.
Okay.
And the newspaper. We literally put out an all call in the local newspaper, the Daily Press or the Goochland Gazette. And say, you know, any veteran willing to drive to PHS or GHS on September 29th to be interviewed by Goochland High students.
And also, I'm shameless. I have business cards, and you know, you're in the grocery store and you see somebody with a veteran's hat. Oh, my husband's like, why do you have to talk to all the old men? But I have to say, my husband is awesome. The first year, and my husband was a civilian, worked for the Army for 35 years. And for the first year, I had no money. And I said, Eddie Morrison, love you. And how about our family fund this project? And he was like, absolutely. And in fact, I'm retiring this year. It's my last year teaching this year. And my principal and superintendent asked me, will you continue to do the Veterans Project? And Eddie Morrison said, absolutely. Like, all the chairs and stuff that are set up, Eddie Morrison did that.
Yeah.
And so, you know, he's my right-hand man. And so, but and at this point in Poquoson is very small. I am not in the grocery store at all till I have somebody say, will you adopt my grandfather? Will you adopt my uncle? And I have people that send me private messages. And the other thing is Poquoson is very small, but I have veterans from Suffolk and Virginia Beach and Norfolk and Portsmouth. So it's not just veterans from Poquoson.
As long as they're willing to come to the school, we'll take them. Go ahead, Erin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
and we'll talk about that in a sec.
We'll talk about that too, because we slept our butts off going to different civic groups.
Absolutely. So we'll hear actually from Mr. Carmines in a minute. He's one of our World War II vets. But again, these are at football games, and that's Mr. Page up there. And so so at her school, the football captains hold hands. At mine, they link arms. But our veteran is an honorary football captain for the night. They get their shirt. They walk across and they do the coin toss. And I always contact the opposing team's coach in advance. And so they know the name of the veteran. So the opposing captains come and say, Mr. Page, thank you for your service, and things like that. It is amazing to see. And like if we have veterans with kids, we'll make the kids a shirt too, and they get to walk out. I had one veteran with a stroller walking out to do the coin toss because he had really little kids who wanted to be on the field with dad.
And this, at both our schools, like the athletic director, the principals, the football coaches are so into it. And so the band director actually invited all of my veterans to come and be on the field with at the homecoming game when they play the national anthem. And in our little town, we have our homecoming parade. The whole town shuts down. And Max has been there. And the homecoming parade, that the veterans are actually the grand marshals.
And we'll show pictures of that.
And I have the Williamsburg Model A Ford Club come and drive them in their Model A's. And then we have other old cars. The car clubs are super happy to come and show off their cars and drive veterans in the parades as well. So what?
And a really cool thing too, another way we get veterans is I don't know why you think, another way we get veterans is our kids. On the first day of school every year, it's my dual enrollment classes and then it's her AP classes that participate in the Veterans Projects. And I kind of introduce it to them every year on the first day of school. And they're like, my dad served. Can I adopt him? Yes, you can. Can my grandpa be my veteran? Absolutely. And so this is Malachi. His mom is our marketing teacher who they do a whole lot with the Veterans Project on the marketing side of things. They design our graphics, they run our website, they run my social media for me. And then his dad, Lieutenant Montgomery. And so he actually was a freshman the first year of our Veterans Project, and he got to be a football captain that night to walk his dad out, which was super, super cool, obviously for a freshman and then now for his dad. But this year he will be in my Veterans Project as an 11th grader, and he is going to adopt his dad this year.
So this was really cool. This is Judge Jake Smith, and he had lost two of his shipmates in a swift boat attack in Vietnam. And I've known him my whole life because he's the judge in York County when you go get your license when you're 16 and he scares you to death. And you know so that's Judge Smith. So he had never been to the wall. And the first time he went to the wall was with our Veterans Project and our field trip. And so his girls helped him find the names. And of course, they died on the same day. So they were right next to each other. So he's etching their names for the very first time. He's crying. I'm crying. His girls are crying. It was super emotional for him. I taught both of his daughters, and both of them called me and were like, Becky, they call me Miss Morrison. So, and I'm like, stop. But they're like, this is the most healing we have ever seen from him. They're like, this was the best thing ever. And Judge Smith actually wants to do the project every year now. And he's the one that nominated me to fly in an F-16 with the Thunderbirds in May. So when he called me and said that, I said, thank you, I think. But then after I did fly with the Thunderbirds, it was awesome. This is LaDawn Kramer, who was a Vietnam nurse. She was on the flight that brought Jeremiah Denton out of North Vietnam. She was his nurse. So it's funny, I have another veteran who's since passed, General Dick Abel, was the pilot on the plane that flew Jeremiah Denton out of North Vietnam, and LaDawn was the nurse. But they had never met each other until sitting in Pocosin High School's auditorium, they figured it out. And that he was the pilot and she was the nurse. And it was just incredible moment. And there's one, and I think we met you that day, Holly.
Holly took that picture. But LaDawn was also instrumental.
Okay, way to go, Holly.
LaDawn was also instrumental in getting the Vietnam Nurses Memorial created. And so it was really cool for her to get to take her girls there and show them that.
And so this was you see them in the Model A in the parade.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a thing at Goochland for First Responders Night. So we get to honor specifically veterans and our deputies and our fire department, which is cool. And we also at Goochland High, our seniors need a senior project to graduate. And so I have kids who become my interns for the year. So I taught these guys their 11th grade year, and this is last year as seniors, they're my interns. And they take a piece of the project and they take really ownership of it. So like Hayden ran our field trip to DC. Easton ran our big fundraiser for the year. And it's a really good way, like this is the restaurant who donated our food for interview day. So it's a really cool way to get the community and get the kids to be leaders of the project. And also it's a great community service opportunity for them because our kids need a certain amount of community service hours to graduate.
We're not going to do 5 minutes.
Right.
Take like 2 minutes. And see if there's, and we don't have to do this right now.
Right.
Because
we'll just tell you what we do.
But there are so many groups in your area that want to give you money. And you just got to go find them. So the first year I schlepped to the Kiwanis Club, the Lions Club, the Exchange Club,
the Rotary
Club, the VFW. And, you know, even church groups. I have local church groups contact me and want to give me, you know, $300. Great, we'll take it. So don't let money be an obstacle for you to do your community service project that you want to do. There's money out there. And since then, I've gotten a $5,000 grant from Dominion Energy, a $6,200 grant from the Newport News Shipyard. I have a veteran right now that's working on a grant from Enterprise Rental Car. So there is money out there to be had, even if it's $200 or $300 here or there, but don't let money be an obstacle that you say, well, I'd like to do this, but I can't because I don't have any money. Because my school gave me no money at all. Her school did.
Yeah. And I begged my superintendent and he was like, okay, I'll help you out. And so now it's a thing. Like now my kids have to go to DC and stuff like that. So it's a really cool kind of precedent to set to keep that going as well. But we also, my community, we have a Marine Corps League. So those guys, my project, a ton of my veterans are Marines. We have like the Pocosa Museum, the Goochland Historical Society, that they want to participate. They want to help, even if they're the ones who volunteer to make food for your interview day. Like you'll take anything. We'll accept all the help we can get.
Right. So we want to tell the stories, and of course, I know everybody's probably familiar with the Louis Zamperini story in Unbroken. And so, go ahead. You talk about your.
Okay, so my kids, as a book study together, we read Unbroken, but at the end, you know, how many of y'all have done the thing that it's like, here's the things that Louis had in his kit, rank them in order of importance. And it's like really crazy what the most important thing is. It's like the mosquito net, right? And you're all surprised. So I do that with the kids, but I actually made a kit. So I went to the dollar store and I got fishing rods and sharks and made the kit for my kids of what Louis had with him. And one at a time, two at a time, they all did it. And these rafts that I got at Walmart are actually the size of Louis' rafts. Like I know they don't look anything like it, but Louis' raft was only 3 foot by 6 foot. And so I picked the 2 tallest boys in my class and said, gentlemen, go ahead. Let me know how comfy that is for you. And of course, then they're like, no, it's not. This is not what he had in the middle of the ocean. Yes, it is. And so to make that real for the kids is really cool. I know it looks silly, but to get the kids involved in the history, not just to read it, not just to talk about it, but to feel it is really cool.
And the other thing is there are local authors and people in your community that you can get in contact with. I had this kid in my class probably 10 years ago, and he was like, my great-grandfather survived the Bataan Death March, escaped away from the Japanese, ran around the Philippines for 6 months, I got recaptured and then survived. I'm like, yeah, okay, kid, right. I didn't believe him. Yeah, he really did. This is his grandfather wrote this story, Humble Hero, about his father. So my student, Corbin Johnson, was telling the truth that his great-grandfather did survive the Bataan Death March. So my students read this book and we do a book study on it. And then we have the author, Mr. Joyner, come in and talk about his father and the story. And like when I read this book, like he was an orphan in Roanoke. He went to a orphanage in Maryland where he got to meet Babe Ruth. And so like I'm reading this book going, I gotta find out what happened to Charlie. Like my husband was like, you're gonna cook dinner? I'm like, maybe not. I gotta find out what happened to Charlie. And so there are local people that you can find and that you can get to come in and talk to your kids about the stories that they can tell.
And there's another,
we know that guy,
right? There's another author you may have heard of. His name is Alex Kershaw, and he's written a lot of World War II books. There's this book called The Liberator. You may have heard of it. You may have a copy. But my kids, so Alex came to talk to my kids specifically about The Liberator. And then when we came to the World War II Memorial in DC, both of our kids, he came to talk to them, and then he came and gave them a tour of the memorial. But I have my kids, so my dual enrollment kids, I have a little bit more freedom than AP. And they actually have to read a book for second semester sometime after the Civil War to present day US history. So most of them, after meeting Alex, picked Alex Kershaw books. And they write a report and we talk about them in class. I put Dunkirk because one girl off my shelf goes, oh, Harry Styles was in the movie. I have to read Dunkirk. Like, whatever gets you to pick a book, I don't care. And they really like, of course, Hacksaw Ridge. But any of these books, The Liberator, we had a day after after Alex came, I had one class period that was going to be ahead of all the other ones. So they begged me and I let them one day watch The Liberator on Netflix because we never watch videos in my class. I'm like, no, let's go. But they then had to go home and they finished the whole thing. Like I had kids come in the next day and were like, I had to know. So I just binged the whole thing. Like, did you do your homework though? But they binged The Liberator. And then on the last week of school, I had kids beg who don't have Netflix who were like, we need to watch the rest. And so they did. And it's just a really cool way, again, that when they get interested in the history, you got to find that thing that invests them and then they're all about it.
And I know that we're lucky because we live in Virginia,
right?
And we're able to have Alex come and talk to our classes. But you can find his things on YouTube,
right?
And when he comes to your class and he talks about The Liberator, you're talking about. I think the last time you came, Alex, there was like 150 kids in there, and you could hear a pin drop. They were like hanging on his every word because he is such a wonderful storyteller, and that's what it's all about, right? Is the stories, like Aaron. That's what it's all about, is the stories. And if you can get the kids to buy into the story, then you got them hook, line, and sinker. And so even though you may not be able to get Alex to come to your class, look it up on YouTube. And because I know that Max has traveled with him before to schools, and it's all there that you can find online. So look at it and see, but your kids will be hooked.
Well, even telling on my kids a little bit that, I pulled them out of class to go to Alex's interview. And I had a couple kids who were like, I thought about skipping it. I was going to go to my math class instead, but I loved it. I'm so glad I went. When is the next time we can see him? I'm like, he's not just going to come be part of our class. We would love that, but they really, really like it.
And the kids are also starstruck too. And the first time, I'm not going to lie. The first time he came in my room, I said, I was starstruck. I was like, I cannot believe Alex Kershaw is sitting in my classroom. And I had a copy of the Bedford Boys that was signed by a Bedford boy who survived years ago. And so remember, Alex, I brought in, I said, Alex, will you sign this like next to that guy's signature? And so a little starstruck, not gonna lie. And the kids are like, oh, Miss Morrison, is he like the most famous person in your contacts? I'm like, yeah, he is. So this is the whole character and the legacy part. This is my granddad right here, who was on the first wave of Utah Beach on D-Day. And you can see that he doesn't have all of his fingers. My daughter asked when she was little, where's Papa's fingers? And I said, well, they're in France. She's like, can we get them? I'm like, no, we're going to leave there. But this is actually my family and a legacy. This is my great-grandfather who fought in World War I. my granddad in World War II, his other grandfather. This is my dad in Vietnam, and this is my nephew, who is currently an Army Ranger. And my nephew, and I have another nephew in the Air Force, was very inspired by his grandfather. In fact, my granddad was one of those that didn't talk about his service until he was dying. And Jacob came home from Ranger School and was sitting at his deathbed, and he just unloaded. And because I think they shared that bond. And what I know from my granddad is from what he told Jacob on his deathbed. And I have to talk about my grandmother. Like, don't get me wrong, I love the military today. My nephew has done 10 tours of Afghanistan and Iraq. I love them so much, but we could Skype when we did open Christmas presents, right? My granddad went to the war, and he told my grandmother, see you when I get back. Right? When's that going to be?
And she had 2 babies at home.
So my grandmother and most of my extended family leaves the mountains in North Carolina. They come to Virginia, and some of them work at the Newport News shipyard, and the rest, they go, my great uncles joined the military, and my granddad. And so my grandmother rented a room in a house for her and her 2 babies. And she had her mother-in-law watch them every day. And she went to work in the defense industry where is now Langley Air Force Base. So again, that sacrifice. And again, we talk about the home front. Like the war wouldn't have been successful without the home front. So like you have to talk about the sacrifices that the women made and children as well. And this is my pilot when I went with the Thunderbirds in May. His name is Major Downey. So his call sign was Simmer Down. And so my call sign was Mother Goose. So you could call me Mother Goose. But he was so inspiring. You can only be a Thunderbird for 2 years because it's so taxing. And they're based in Las Vegas. Well, his family had never seen him fly as a Thunderbird. So he's from Northern Virginia. So his family came down to Langley Air Force Base to see him fly for the first time as a Thunderbird. His 97-year-old grandfather, who was a Pacific World War II veteran, came to see him fly that day with me. It was so awesome. And he told me, he said, that's why I'm a pilot. That's why I became a Thunderbird. That's why I joined the Air Force, is because of his 97-year-old grandfather and the influence he had over him by being a World War II vet. So again, even though it's like, I don't know how many of y'all have people that were in the military that inspired other members of your family to join, but that's a big part of it.
This is my student, Josh. He was my head intern last year. And he is now a freshman at the Coast Guard Academy. And that's why he's doing what he's doing as well. The Veterans Project truly inspired him. Alex, he said after hearing you speak after our field trip at the WWII Memorial, he goes, I ship off in a month. And hearing that is why I do what I do, why I want to serve our country as well.
So we don't have to answer this now because of time. But again, we were charged with leaving here to do a community service project. So I just want you guys to jumpstart thinking about what you want to do. If there's something like part of what we do that you want to incorporate in and yours, if you want us to help you, any advice that we can give, we love to help you with that. So one of the things real quick is they stopped during COVID, but now they're going to start it again in September. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans will send you a traveling trunk. Has anybody done that before? Okay. The trunk has like 15 items in it, and it could have underwear. It could have a yearbook. I've gotten a periscope before. I've got
ration cards.
The high school yearbooks are always a big draw that the kids like. And what I do is I set up stations, and I think it's like $150. It's very minimal, and you get to keep the trunk for a week. And so I set up stations with questions, and the kids go from station to station talking about like a Life magazine from the time. So it's very like I've gotten a grease can before, Trinonite. What is that right? Trinitite. I've gotten before. So that is really good. And I was looking online, they're going to start that again in September. They stopped it during COVID, and then of course there's traveling exhibits. Our veterans and kids participate in Reach Across America. This guy right here, Mr. Howard, he and Curtis became BFFs. Like they would get together on Saturdays and watch Virginia Tech baseball football games. Howard got drafted, went to Vietnam, came back and played baseball at Virginia Tech. And so he wanted to throw out the first pitch at a baseball game. And because he had done that, and there was some news coverage of that, Virginia Tech actually asked him to come throw out a first pitch at one of their baseball games. And I mean, he called me bawling. In fact, he tracked me down one day at school, after school, and he said, Becky, a lot of my very good friends didn't even know I was in Vietnam. He said, but because of the project, I was able to open up. And he said, it's so healing. He said, I'm getting free hearing aids. He said, I'm getting a stipend monthly because I was exposed to Agent Orange. He said, it has really allowed me to heal opening up with the project.
Again, we don't have time to do some of these questions.
Yeah.
The next 2 slides, I ask you, number 1, do you have kind of some reservations or any questions for us about either incorporating the greatest generation into your classroom or the projects themselves? Obviously, some pieces of the project are labor intensive or expensive. You need to write the grants and stuff like that, or just to incorporate a piece of it to do at one football game to honor a veteran, to at least have that over the loudspeaker, something like that. And the whole school loves it. Every Friday night, kids that we don't even teach come to both of our classrooms and say, who's our veteran tonight? And stuff like that. And then the whole student section, as our veterans walk past to get off the field when they're done, are chanting USA. And the veterans love it. They stop in front of the student section and are like, hey, like it's their parade. And like, we have to get them off the team so the football team can come.
So at my school for the homecoming game, I have all my veterans come out. So instead of wearing our school colors on our homecoming game, our kids always wear red, white, and blue instead of our school colors, because that's how important they vote to do that. That they think it's more important to wear red, white, and blue to honor all those veterans at halftime.
Great. Richard, I really like your question. What if the veterans say something off color? So I prep my kids ahead of time, the whole time, that my job is your safety, your comfort more than honoring these veterans. We love to honor these veterans, but my job is the kids. And I tell them that, and by the time we bring in the veterans, they know me, they trust me, all that kind of stuff. We've only ever, in the 5 years we've done this, or 6 years, we've only ever had to ask one veteran not to come back. He said something we didn't super appreciate, and our school is very supportive of that as well. But the kids, A, trust us enough to come tell us, and B, we circulate the whole time. We talk the whole time. And also for me, I have my interns who also, last year I had 6, this year I have 9. And those kids also circulate at every table. They sit at every table to, again, make sure. And the kids know, we talk to them ahead of time too, on if you don't like where this is headed, let's steer it back to their service. You know, if an inappropriate joke,
Or call us over.
Right. Our veterans love inappropriate jokes. And so, you know, if our kids don't, they're very good about kind of steering it back to their service.
All right. So any questions? I know we've run over time. I'm sorry.
Yeah. We like to talk. Sorry.
Yeah.
15 years ago, the group of high school teachers lobbied the Texas legislature to award high school diplomas to veterans.
That's so cool.
I didn't
Yeah.
know Virginia had done anything.
He was not from Virginia. I think he was from Ohio originally. I'm not sure. Yeah,
I mean,
would do that. I'm not sure. I don't know.
I don't think.
Teresa, there enlistment in the military since he's gone, and where
With our students, I have more kids going ROTC
Yeah.
because of this. But we're from a military town anyway, like Langley Air Force Base is right there, you know, Fort Eustis, Norfolk Naval Weapons Station, and, you know, all that is right in our area. So we're kind of a military town anyway.
Great. And she's talked about like ROTC, they go ROTC in college. But my kids do, my school, we have ROTC in our building as well. So if you're lucky enough to have that, partner with those people because they have been very helpful in recruiting veterans for me, as well as their kids, even if they're not yet in my class. The underclassmen ROTC kids help man my stuff. They provide the work to set up the tables and chairs and stuff like that. Are there questions online? I can't.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys so much.
Thanks so much.
So I wanted to also say that your presentation, reason why I liked it so much is because both of you and your amazing daughter were what I would say is in the flow. So you are presenting in the flow, doing something that is very fulfilling for you. That's you at your best. That's your natural life essence coming to the surface, and you're in the moment, and it shows.
Thank you.
So I'm very quickly going to take you through a narrative about 4 Americans who found themselves in the flow of trauma and heroism in World War II, where they became supreme warriors and where they found themselves in the flow, but in a different environment to the one that you just found yourselves in. So I became fascinated by the notion of what it took, what kind of characteristics you have to earn the Medal of Honor. Note that I don't say win the Medal of Honor. Medal of Honor recipients would never describe themselves as winners of a medal. So I started to think about this, and I thought about how can I tell a story about Medal of Honor recipients from World War II? And I did a bunch of research. I went out to Oregon and I met a guy called Bob Maxwell. I think I might have told you guys about this gentleman before. This was 2019, and he was the oldest living recipient of the Medal of Honor. He was 98 years old. There were only 5 Americans alive at the time. This is 2019 who'd received the Medal of Honor. 5 from 472. Over 50% of the 472 recipients received their medal after they died. They're posthumous. So this was an extraordinary privilege for me. Bob Maxwell left a great impression on me. It took a long time for me to persuade his friend to get Bob to pull out his medal and actually wear it for me. Very, very religious guy, and he belonged to the 3rd Infantry Division. So very quickly, hands up anybody knows anything about the 3rd ID. Okay, one person. The 3rd ID received 40 medals of honor. So to this day, today, they officially have 40 medals of honor. 101st Airborne, can anybody guess how many the 101st Airborne have? These are the glamour boys that you all know won World War II single-handedly. Guess how many they have? They have 2. And in fact, both of those medals of honor were received a day apart in the fall of 1944 during Operation Market Garden. 117 days on the line, 2 medals of honor. 3rd ID, over 350 days in combat, and they have 40. There's a very simple reason why they have 20 times as many medals, and that's because they were in extremely fierce, brutal combat for a lot longer. In fact, longer than any other division, American division, of the 90-odd that liberated or were part of the liberation of Western Europe. 3rd ID fought from the very first day that you could fight in the European theater right until the bitter end. 5 amphibious invasions. Highest number of fatalities. All of the campaigns, 10 campaigns to liberate Western Europe. They gave the most, they fought the hardest, and therefore they received the most medals. Importantly, they lost the most lives. So if there's any one unit that we should talk about in terms of ultimate courage, ultimate determination, and ultimate sacrifice, it is the 3rd Infantry Division. That's their route there. That's an unbelievable odyssey from North Africa here in November 1942, Sicily, July 1943, 80 years ago to the day. As I talk to you now, 80 years ago, the 3rd ID were on a forced march called the Truscott Trot. These guys didn't walk, they didn't run, but it was something in between. And as I speak to you today, they were on their way to Palermo, crossing Sicily, which is right there. You guys know where Sicily is. It's an epic journey, and one that when you get to the end of it, and I've been not the North African part, but I've pretty much followed the entire route from Sicily onwards, and it's an awful long way. And you go to villages, you cross rivers, you cross streams, you go to a street corner, you go to a mountain, and you think to yourself, every single place that you are, American lives were on the line. Americans died to take each of these villages. There's a lot of streams, a lot of mountains, a lot of countries to cross before you get to the very end. This is Morris Britt. So of the 40 guys, I was shameless. I decided I'm just going to pick the 4 that I like most, that I find most interesting. And hopefully I can have them be in combat together. So I have this ability to be able to tell the story of a small unit. To tell the story of World War II, to tell the story of the European theater, to tell the story of an entire division means that you have way too many characters. It means that your reader or your pupils can't attach emotionally to key characters. So the smaller the number, the better. So I thought, okay, I'll pick 4. 3 of them happen to be in the 15th Infantry Regiment. That's the most decorated infantry regiment in US history, 15th ID. And the greatest honor, I believe, of my life is when I became an honorary member of the 15th Infantry Regiment about 2 years ago. So to be a civilian, to be a Limey civilian, and to be an honorary member, that was a huge deal. This is a guy that didn't belong to the 15th Infantry Regiment, and I'm going to speed up. This is Captain Morris Britt. So this guy is the first American, because they didn't hand out the Bronze Star in World War I, but they did in World War II. This is the first Yank, the first American to get what was called the full set. It's a Bronze Star, Silver Star, DSC, and the Medal of Honor. So by December 1944, he was a superstar in this country. He's the first guy to win every medal, earn every medal that you could earn in war. Came from Arkansas, very poor background, very humbling background. With all the characters I'm going to talk about, except for one, they were brutalized before they got into combat. They were tough. They knew tragedy. They had grieved either the loss of their mother, their father, or a close relative. They had been toughened and brutalized by life itself before they even got into what became an horrific, endlessly traumatic experience, which is combat in World War II. He actually went to the University of Arkansas and was a really good football player. And before he landed in November 1942 as part of Operation Torch, he played for the Detroit Lions. So he's actually was a professional NFL player. And we will come back to him in a while. This is the 3rd ID commander, the 3rd Infantry Division commander, Lucien Truscott. He took over command of the 3rd ID for the invasion of Sicily. That's the 10th of July, 1943. The 10th of July, 1943 is when the first of you started to kill and die to liberate a place that I love, Europe. That's the 10th of July, 1943, almost 80 years ago to this day. Very sophisticated, very well educated. Look at the 3 stars on his helmet. Look at his face. This is a guy that was described by Patton as being one of the great infantry division commanders of World War II. He arrived in the European theater with a lot of booze and a copy of War and Peace. So these were gentlemen. These were gentlemen warriors that led with great panache and with a sense of history and their place in history. There's Audie Murphy, probably the most famous infantryman of World War II. Some say the most decorated soldier in US history. We can definitely say that he is the most decorated US infantryman to have served in the European theater. By the end of the war, he will, like Morris Britt, have received every medal that you can possibly gain for courage in combat, and becomes, right at the end of the war, the most decorated guy in the European theater. Rejected. We were talking yesterday or the day before when we were at the FDR Memorial about the fact that amazingly 40% odd of Americans that were inducted were not seen as physically fit. Now, in Murphy's case, he was underweight, rejected by the Marines, rejected by the Army and the Navy. finally was drafted in early 1943. Again, a classic case of someone that was brutalized. His father left his large family, 7, I think 8 brothers and sisters, grew up in the cotton fields of Texas, started picking cotton when he was like 9, 10 years old to feed his family. His father abandoned the family. His mother died when he was 16. So this is a kid that had had it really tough before he even got into uniform. Audie Murphy first saw action on the 10th of July 1943 in B Company of the 15th Infantry Regiment. And this is a photograph of a 7th Army casualty. He belonged to the 7th Army. This is during the height of the Sicilian campaign. By the end of August 1943, we had crossed Sicily. Patton had beaten Montgomery to Messina and became the great conqueror of Sicily. And that is the successful conclusion of the first major battle to liberate Europe, July 1943. First amphibious invasion for Audie Murphy, but the second for Maurice Britt and the 3rd Infantry Division. This is a character that I became very attached to. He's the only one of the 4 gentlemen I'm going to talk about that didn't have an impoverished background. And he came from a well-to-do Connecticut family. His father was a highly decorated World War I veteran and a successful lawyer in Manhattan. He went to West Point, and in 1943, he complained about 2 things when it comes to West Point. He said he really hated the hazing, which suggests, why would you go to West Point if you didn't want to get hazed? It's a part of the tradition. And he didn't like the regimentation. He didn't like taking orders. So again, why would you be at West Point? In 1943, he was in the classroom at West Point, and he picked up his books, threw them in the corner, and said, I'm done. I've had enough of this. And he left West Point and then enlisted as a private in the 1st Infantry Division. And his first day of combat was Omaha Beach, 6th of June, 1944. Arrived around 1:15 in the afternoon. So this is a guy that basically said no to being an officer and went and said, you know what, there's a war on. I'm not going to sit in a classroom. I'm going to go and do my part right now, however I can. And that's actually his plebe. I'm going to go back. That's actually his plebe photograph. It's a beautiful photograph. It's like, look how high, how tall he is. He's almost 6'4". Big target. I remember talking to a Frenchman who was a commando. He actually died like last week or the week before. He was the last of the 177 Frenchmen to land in Normandy on D-Day. Imagine what a huge deal that is. You're a Frenchman, you land on D-Day to liberate your own country. There's a guy called Leon Gautier, and he was about 5'6" tall. And when I interviewed him, he said, Alex, you know what? You wouldn't have lasted very long because you can't get low. You have to get low and be able to fire at the same time and run fast. Audie Murphy was absolutely fantastic at that. So at 6'4", he was a walking target. This is the 5th Army. 7th Army is Sicily. Then the 5th Army takes over the Italian campaign. So November 1942, 1st amphibious invasion. Sicily, July 1943, 2nd amphibious invasion. The 3rd ID is Salerno, September 1943. The Italian campaign was a controversial campaign, over 100,000 American casualties, and it was basically a nightmare. From Salerno, where we almost were defeated, not enough landing craft, not enough men landed, very, very bitter fighting. We came very close to defeat. From Salerno all the way up the jagged spine of Italy, the 3rd Infantry Division fought in the fall of 1943. Truscott said by November 1943 that he was afraid that his beautiful division, these wonderful young men, had basically been wiped out. You are breaking my division. You're breaking the heart and soul of an incredible group of fighting Americans because the fighting was so tough. Mountains, mules, and men, as Ernie Powell described this campaign. You got to the top of one mountain, if you were lucky enough to still be alive. You looked out, if it wasn't rainy and cloudy, you could perhaps see the peak of another mountain, and you knew that the next day you'd have to take yet another mountain. And in what seemed like an endless range of mountains and strife. And that's a really lovely photograph of the 5th Army on the march in the fall of 1943. Britt Was a company commander. By the time you get to November 1943, and at Mount Rotundo, which is north of Naples, he earned the Medal of Honor. Now, when you look at his citation, it's almost as if it's comical. It's like something out of a comic book. And I became fascinated by World War II when I was 8 or 9 by reading countless comics about action heroes. So when I read his citation, I was like, oh my God, it's something like, you just can't make this up. You couldn't make this up. He was described as a one-man army. Basically, Germans attacked his company, a full company of Germans attacked his company, and he and several others repelled this attack. In doing that, he saved his own company and then a couple of others on top of a mountain called Mount Rotundo. He used every weapon that he could find, the M1, the BAR, carbine, someone estimated that he threw over 30 grenades. In any case, it was an incredible act of individual heroism. In the press, he was described as acting like a one-man army, which he really objected to, fiercely objected to that comment and said, I was not a one-man army. I was never part of a one-man army. It was people around me. You don't win a battle. You don't win anything in a war unless you're surrounded by incredible comrades. And that's a scrapbook from, that's a page from his scrapbook that his grandson managed to get to me through the archives at the University of Arkansas. That's a photograph of Mount Rotundo. You'll see the nature of the landscape here. Brutal, horrible fighting. And by the end of the fall of 1943, the 3rd ID had been in continuous combat for almost 3 months and had set a record for the longest period that you could be in combat, that you actually were in combat in World War II. So you can imagine going for 3 months without a shower, without hot food, constantly in combat, without proper sleep, often under incredible conditions, cold, windy, malnutrition, combat fatigue. 3 months is a very long time not to get a break from war. There's Maurice Britt in May 1944. There's a really beautiful smile on his face. And you'll notice that his arm is missing here. November 1942, number 1, Sicily, number 2, Salerno, number 3. 4th amphibious invasion for the 3rd ID is Anzio, January 1944. I don't know how many people in the room know much about the Battle of Anzio, but it was a 3-month stalemate. We arrived, incredibly low casualties. In the next few days, the Germans counterattacked, trapped us on the plain of Anzio, south of Rome, and it was a slugging match, a war of attrition for about 3 months. In early February of 1944, as a company commander, his arm was blown off by a tank shell. The 12 guys in the room, he was spotting tanks, he was stood at an open window, the shell came right through the window and killed 12 guys in the room behind him. His life was saved by a technical sergeant who took off his belt, performed a tourniquet, and somehow he lived. But there were hundreds of small shrapnel wounds. When the shell went off, shrapnel went everywhere. And for the rest of his life, he might be smiling there, but for the rest of his life, he was in continuous pain. So that's him in Georgia. He's in a hospital in Atlanta, and that's a publicity photograph because he was a famous NFL player and came back and was very happy to become part of the US Army's propaganda campaign to raise war bonds, etc. This is the breakout of Anzio in May 1944. So I think some of you might remember that I mentioned there was one day when one unit lost more men than any other in World War II. It's the 23rd of May 1944 when the Allies broke out from the first day that they tried to break out from Anzio. And the 3rd ID had over 900 casualties in one day, which is extraordinary when you really think about it. To try and minimize the casualties, somebody came up with this idea of dragging GIs behind vehicles in these boats. So that, the idea was that they wouldn't be mown down by German machine gun fire. It was a nice idea, but it didn't work. You still had 900 men, mostly killed by machine gun fire on that one day alone. We break out of Anzio, and then we rush towards Rome, and Rome falls on the 4th of June, 1944. This is the first Axis city to fall to the Allies, the 4th of June, 1944. And on the 5th of June, the very next day, here you have Morris Britt at the Razorback Stadium in Arkansas. And he's just down here. You can see that his sleeve is tucked into his uniform, and he's there receiving the Medal of Honor, 5th of June, 1944, literally just a few hours before D-Day, 6th of June, 1944, the so-called one and only D-Day, by which time his own division have been in 4 amphibious invasions. This is September 1944. It's a really interesting photograph. It comes after the 5th amphibious invasion for the 3rd ID, which was Operation Dragoon. Operation Dragoon was the most successful amphibious invasion for the Americans in World War II. You landed in the most beautiful part of France, in Provence, on the Côte d'Azur. I've actually been to the very beach where Audie Murphy came ashore and others. This is the most beautiful part of France, of anywhere in Europe that you could land and fight. And then the Allies, the French and the Americans predominantly, rushed up the Rhone Valley towards Germany. And the 19th German Army, the German Army, the 19th Army, was in fast retreat, didn't put up much opposition. Here, the retreating Germans were trapped and caught, and P-47s went to work and massacred hundreds of Germans as they were in their vehicles here. And as the 3rd ID passed by, they had to push the vehicles to the side. And it was called the Avenue of Stenches because even weeks after the P-47s had gone to work, you could smell death and rotting carcasses. There's Alexander Patch and his son, also called Alexander. Patch, there's a memorial to Patch actually on the beach in Provence, near Saint-Tropez, to Alexander Patch. And he is the 7th Army commander. So 5th Army in Italy, the 7th Army is the Allied army that is coming up from the south of France towards the German border. He's 53 years old. He has around 200,000 men under his command. He doesn't sleep. He's under enormous stress. And there his son, his only son, was killed in October 1944. I used this photograph to illustrate a minor story, but an important story emotionally, which is that a lot of army commanders, or rather senior officers, generals in World War II, actually had their sons fighting at the same time. So if you read the diaries and you read the correspondence of Patch, it's quite heartbreaking. It was a very moving experience for me because his son was wounded and then was pulled off the line. And the father writes back to his wife in Virginia, you know, our son's been wounded. I'm looking after him. Everything's going to be okay. And his wife begs him to not allow their son, their only child, to go back into combat. He says, enough's enough. And he, of course, the son, wants to emulate the father, wants to carry on, and goes back into combat and then is killed. So you can imagine his anguish when he has to write back to his wife, by the way, I didn't carry out your wishes. I allowed our son to go back. That was a very, very difficult letter to have to write indeed. This is a photograph of Siegelsheim. I don't know whether you guys know where Siegelsheim is. I had no idea where it was, but that's basically Germany in the background there. And this is in the Colmar Pocket, known to GIs as the frozen crust. The Battle of the Colmar Pocket took place in December and January, December 1944, January 1945. You're right on the border in Alsace-Lorraine with Germany in the background here. This is a main entry point into the Third Reich. And the SS in particular, the Wehrmacht, want to stop us getting to the Rhine. And they basically, as Audie Murphy described it, they created what was called an iron fist. He described it like an iron fist pushed into France with the Rhine behind it. And it was an iron fist to stop the French and particularly the Americans getting through the Rhine and then into Nazi Germany. Very, very fierce fighting took place at the same time as the Battle of the Bulge. And here is Holzwehr, which is not far from Colmar, not far from the Rhine. And this, on the 26th of January 1945, Audie Murphy stood on that burning tank for around about an hour and repulsed several German attacks. He was wounded. And for this action, for saving his own company, B Company of the 15th Infantry Regiment, He later received the Medal of Honor. So this is his action for receiving the Medal of Honor here at Holtzwihr on the 26th of January, 1945. It's near, it's in Alsace-Lorraine. It's near Colmar. So, you know, literally like 20 miles from the Rhine. Very close indeed. So I mentioned earlier on, Michael Daly. You saw his picture at West Point. He comes ashore as a private in a Higgins boat on Omaha Beach on the 6th of June, 1944, fights across Normandy, receives 2 Silver Stars, is wounded in September 1944 near Aachen. I think you guys may remember me mentioning Aachen before, which is the first German city that Americans tried to take in the fall of 1944 and suffered enormous casualties, disturbing casualties, casualties that actually unnerved the Allied senior command. What's going to happen later on, if this is the very first time that we fought for a German city, what's going to happen next? And what happened next was that the Germans fought incredibly hard and very effectively. But this is him in the Colmar pocket. Wounded September 1944, he was in the 1st Infantry Division, 16th Infantry Regiment, the big red one, the 1st ID, wounded with the 1st ID near Aachen, comes off the line, actually goes and works for Alexander Patch as 7th Army commander, because Alexander Patch is a really good friend of his dad. So there was nepotism. There were, you know, it did matter who you knew in World War II. And like Patch's son, Michael Daly says, I'm not going to spend the rest of the war as a driver of an army commander. He was a terrible driver, apparently. Patch was almost killed a couple of times because he was such a bad driver. So although Patch didn't really want to send his good friend's son back into combat, especially after he'd lost his own son, he also didn't want him as his driver anymore because he was very, very reckless driver. So he sends him back into combat. He gets his wish. Michael Daly gets his wish. By now, he's had battlefield promotion. He's a lieutenant, and he joins the 15th Infantry Regiment of the 3rd ID, to which Audie Murphy still belonged. And he joins the infantry regiment, the 15th Infantry Regiment, at the height of the fighting in the Colmar pocket. Goes from the 1st Infantry Division to the 3rd in January of 1945. I love this photograph because it actually shows you some of the things we've been talking about. You look at this is a thin guy, the tall, thin company. By this time, he's a company commander. So he has 200 beating hearts. At full strength, a company, infantry company is 200 guys. At no point at this stage of the war is a company fully intact. Usually it's around 50, 60% if you're lucky. But it's around, he's had at any one time, he has around about 100 Americans, young Americans, and he is only 19 years old here, under his command. And this is him after he's gone several days without any real sleep in combat, and you can see that's an image of leadership, of endurance, of perseverance, of an immense spirit. Very long, slim fingers he had. We crossed the Rhine on the 9th of Colmar pocket, finally, after large casualties concludes. We crossed the Rhine on the 9th of March, 1945, and the Siegfried Line. And then this is early April of 1945. For the first time in the European theater, American forces start to move at real speed. In Normandy, the 3rd Army, yes, for 3 or 4 weeks, but this is the first time for the 7th Army and the 3rd Infantry Division that they actually start to really roll. And thanks to one of Hitler's inventions, the Autobahn here, and they're heading there towards southeast Bavaria, towards the Alps. That's a picture of Nuremberg in April 1945. I mean the British, we had picked certain targets in Germany right from the beginning of the war to try and prove to the Nazis that we weren't just going to be bombed, but we could come back and we could hit them. Nuremberg was the target for the Royal Air Force as early as 1940. In January 1945, we basically destroyed most of the medieval center of Nuremberg, firebombed it. We firebombed Hamburg, we firebombed Dresden. We killed at least 35,000 people, the Americans and the British at Dresden in early March of 1945. And Nuremberg basically was one vast ruin. By the time Michael Daly, as A company commander, arrived in Nuremberg, it was held by a stalwart of SS soldiers. And in the Holocaust Museum yesterday afternoon, I talked about the SS, the Schutzstaffel. These are the most fanatical of Hitler's followers. And they literally fought to the last breath or the last bullet in many parts of Germany. So Michael Daly, on the 17th of April, 1945, as A company commander, came into the heart of Nuremberg, and his Medal of Honor citation describes him taking out 4 machine gun nests, killing at least a dozen Germans, and also taking his company right to the very heart of the medieval center of Nuremberg. I want you to look at these ruins here and imagine that that is replicated throughout most of Germany. So one of the things that is an advantage for the defenders is that it's rubble and snipers can hide easily in rubble. And on the 18th of April, the day after he had performed these actions for which he would receive the Medal of Honor, he got to the very heart, very center of Nuremberg, and there was a medieval wall. It's around about 12 foot high. I was there about 6 weeks ago. He acted as the scout, as the lead, the point guy for his own company, which is unusual for a company commander. It should have been somebody else. And he gets to the edge of this wall, steps up onto some rubble, and puts his head over, just right over the edge of this 12-foot high wall. There's a crack. It's a sniper round, an SS sniper, and the bullet hits him and goes through his head, or rather his face. So the bullet entered here, exited here, broke his palate, broke his jaw, and he falls down onto some rubble and starts to bleed out. The kind of character he was, he reaches into his jacket pocket and pulls out a pencil, and then rams the pencil down his throat and performs what's basically a primitive tracheotomy on himself, clearing his windpipe. A couple of minutes later, a medic comes over, they dump him on the front of a Jeep, he's taken to the nearest aid station, and they place him in a part of the aid station where the surgeons ignore these wounded because they've got more serious cases. They've got cases where they can actually save possibly their lives. A nurse walks past, Daly grabs her uniform and is able to express his desire to live, grabs her, he's operated on and miraculously survived. Also, while we were in the Holocaust Museum yesterday, I don't know whether some of you guys stopped with me as we looked at the Nuremberg rallies display in the Holocaust Museum. That's actually taken on the main stadium at the Zeppelin field, and about 2 or 3 yards past in this direction from this gentleman here with the sunglasses is the podium where Hitler ranted and raved throughout the 1930s to 200,000 odd fanatical followers. This is the only time during World War II that 5 individuals from one unit were decorated on the actual battlefield itself. And they are gentlemen, all these 5 guys are from the 3rd Infantry Division. And you'll notice this beautiful patch here on the shoulder, the blue and the white stripes. They're otherwise known as the Marne men. And this is on the 23rd of April, 1945, the day after Nuremberg fell to American forces. One gentleman in particular I want to point out here is a guy called Keith Ware. Before the war, he was a manager of a retail store in California, a pen pusher. He was drafted into the US Army, and his first day of action was the 10th of July, 1943, as B Company commander with Audie Murphy in his company. So Audie Murphy's first combat leader was this guy here, Keith Ware. He is the only draftee in US military history who was a draftee, who then became a general officer. So he rose all the way through the ranks. And here his rank is actually lieutenant colonel. And he has fought all the way from the 10th of July, 1943 in Sicily, across Sicily, Italy, through France, Colmar Pocket, across the Rhine, all the way to Nuremberg. And this is only literally a couple of weeks from the end of the war. And he's wearing the sunglasses here. And he received the Medal of Honor for actions at Siegelsheim when single-handedly he took out, again, 3 or 4 German machine gun nests and helped save not only his company, B Company, but the battalion that he led by then as a lieutenant colonel. And in my book, Against All Odds, you can read the citation in detail. It's a really, really lovely photograph. It shows you 5 extraordinary guys from this one division, 5 of the 40 men who received the Medal of Honor in that division. Where here is 26, these guys would all be in their early 20s. You know, the average age of a GI, if we go to Normandy, where there are, 7,500 odd Americans buried there, the average age there is 22. So
I asked the other 17.
Yeah.
They all look very, very much.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a very good point. It's a very good question, because Audie Murphy was 20 years old when he earned the Medal of Honor. Michael Daly was 20 years old when he earned the Medal of Honor. And it wasn't unusual by this point in the war to have a 20-year-old leading 100, 200 guys in combat. And that's an extraordinary responsibility. An awful lot of people's lives you've got in your hands as a very young person.
Second guy from the front is Staff Sergeant Lucien Adams. He's from Port Arthur, Texas, which is where I grew up.
There you go.
And there's an elementary school named after him.
Great, really good point. Thank you. That's awesome.
I thought he looked familiar, and I was like, pardon me? Yes, the Lucien Adams. Yes, yeah. The high school is on Staff Sergeant Lucien Adams.
I'm going to speed up now anyway. So, VE Day, 7th of May, 1945, the Germans surrender, 2:41 a.m. Eisenhower sends a telegram from Rheims, mission of this Allied force is accomplished. 8th of May now is known as VE Day. We've celebrated it at the World War II Memorial. And the Third ID, the headquarters for the Third ID is in Salzburg, where the Sound of Music was based. And Audie Murphy was given the choice. You can receive the medal at the White House from Truman, or you can receive it in the place, in the European theater. And he chose to receive it surrounded by members of the Third ID. And that's him saluting Alexander Patch, the guy I showed you earlier on. And he's just 20 years old there. He's been in combat for over 200 days. Some people say he killed 200 Germans. We don't know exactly, but he has received every single medal that you can receive for valor in World War II. And that's in Salzburg on airfield on the 15th of June, 1945. Here's Michael Daly. He came back and that's him receiving his medal 23rd of August 1945 at the White House from Truman. And I love this photograph because Daly was extremely religious. He was a very devout Catholic, prayed all the time. And it's almost as if this is sort of an act of benediction. He's got his eyes closed, he's receiving this ultimate accolade in the White House on the 23rd of August 1945. This is the largest, that should be 1945, by the way. And this is the largest number of Americans who received the Medal of Honor gathered in the White House in history. I think there are some 28 Americans there receiving the Medal of Honor from Truman over here. It's a beautiful photograph. This is Michael Daly returning back to his small hometown in Connecticut the day after he received the medal. And right at the front of the photograph here, obscured somewhat, is his father. And later on, Michael Daly said in an interview that he wished it had been his father that had received the medal and not him. He did not want to be a public hero. He did not want to come back and be treated as a superstar. He wanted to come back, be alone, hug his mother, and grieve, like a lot of these guys. The adjustment back to peacetime America was very difficult for him. The war had ended by now, and for him and many others who'd fought in the Pacific, the European theater, the contrast between the Europe or the places they'd left in the Pacific and America was very, very dislocating, very alienating. And he also, as I mentioned, he wanted to grieve. He didn't want to be paraded around constantly as this incredible hero. There's Audie Murphy, and he has like film style looks there. And as some of you obviously know, he did become a film star. This is a picture of him taken in France in 1948. That was the first time that he went back after the war. There's an interesting story about him, which is that in the July issue of Life magazine in 1945, his face was the cover of Life magazine. And in Hollywood, a guy called Jimmy Cagney, do you know, you've heard of Jimmy Cagney? He picked up Life magazine and he thought to himself, my goodness, this guy's really handsome. He should be a movie star. It was Audie Murphy, the poster boy for American heroism in World War II. And Cagney contacted him in Texas in September 1945 and said, look, come out to Hollywood. I'll try and make you into a movie star, literally. And there's a great photograph of Murphy getting off a plane in Hollywood in the fall of 1945. He's greeted by Cagney. Cagney puts him up in at his place in the Hollywood Hills, sends him to a gym. Cagney said he looked traumatized. It was really disturbing to look at this young kid, still just 21 years old. Fed him up, sent him to a gym, paid for some acting classes, and by 1947, 48, Murphy starts to receive some minor parts in Hollywood movies. And then in 1955, stars in a movie called To Hell and Back, which is based on his own best-selling book, To Hell and Back. And I think for Paramount Pictures, the film To Hell and Back in 1955 was the highest grossing movie in their history. And he went on to star in over 21 Westerns and many other films. Really talented country and Western songwriter too, and literally became a movie star. And that's him in one of his better films, Red Badge of Courage, 1951. It was directed by John Huston, one of the best Hollywood directors ever. And Huston said that when he met Murphy on the first day of filming, he was disturbed by Murphy. And he said, you know, what was it like there, etc. And Murphy was very reluctant to talk about what he'd been through. But he said that, you know, it's very hard to get excited about anything in life. It's very difficult to get really, really excited about anything because it's as if basically all of his adrenaline has been used up through all the time he spent in combat. And Huston said there was something missing there. It was as if he'd left a large part of him back in Europe on the battlefields. Murphy suffered from terrible PTSD. You know, he slept with a revolver under his pillow or by his bedside. His first wife didn't appreciate that very much. He would wake up and have nightmares and shoot the clock or a picture frame. Was not a drinker at all, but he was a very heavy gambler. Gambled an awful lot. In fact, some people say that by the 1960s, he started to owe money to the mob because they were the only people that would lend him money so he could go and gamble. So the gambling was his replacement, was his substitute for the buzz that he'd got during World War II. There's Keith Ware, the guy with the sunglasses in Nuremberg. He was the only one of my four guys that stayed in the US Army, and he actually chose to go to Vietnam, and he became the division commander for the Big Red One. That's the patch on his shoulder there, and lost his life in 1968. 13th of September 1968. He's 53 years old, and his helicopter was shot down in Cambodia. We were not supposed to be in Cambodia in 1968, but the Viet Cong, the enemy, were. So he went, as he had in World War II, he went to where the enemy were, and his helicopter was shot down. There's Audie Murphy, died at age just 46 when a small plane crashed into a mountain not far from you guys. Actually, it's in Virginia, it's near Roanoke. Ironically, the color of the plane that he crashed in was blue and white, which is the same colors as his division command man, the 3rd ID. Here you have Morris Britt. He actually passed away in surgery And it was complications to a wound he'd received in World War II that actually ended up killing him. He was admitted for another ailment, another problem, but while they're in surgery, it was a complication to his World War II wound that ended up killing him. So he became a very successful businessman after the war. He never played football again, obviously, was constantly in pain from his wounds, actually ended up becoming lieutenant governor of Arkansas. Very fierce opponent of segregation. Left the Democrat Party because in the South, the Democrats were in support of segregation in many areas, and had a very successful business career after the war. And his grandson, I interviewed him at great length, and he said that there wasn't a day that he saw his grandfather where he wasn't smiling. He was a very positive, very upbeat, buoyant spirit. And there you have one of the last photographs I could find of Michael Daly. He, like so many GIs who came back from the war, struggled for quite some time to find a mission, a life purpose. And he said that nothing in his life had compared to the sense of satisfaction and pride he had felt as a 20-year-old leading a company, an infantry company in World War II. He said that he'd never seen so many different Americans from different backgrounds so united, with such a sense of purpose, with such a sense of mission. And for the rest of his, through his 20s and 30s and into his 40s, he was looking for a sense of purpose, as he called it, a cause greater than self, which would be equal or similar to the one he felt in World War II. Finally, he started to volunteer at a veterans hospital in Connecticut, started to raise money for that hospital, and he found that through giving to others, through service to others, as he called it, he found what he described also as a cause greater than himself, greater than his own ego. The secret to happiness, he said, to contentment rather, did not lie in several houses and lots of money and materialism. It lay in actual service to others. The satisfaction that he received, the greatest satisfaction in his life, he said, came from actually helping others, which is a moral that I like to spread when I go into high schools, etc., and say, look, what does success mean? How are you going to spend your life? Are you just going to live out the so-called superficial American dream, which is to be rich? Or are you actually going to do something for other people? By the end of your life, you might look back and think, maybe it was a wonderful thing that I was one of you, that I was a teacher rather than the banker. Maybe the accumulation of the wonders that you have performed, even though you may not know it, the lives that you've changed, even though you may not know it, maybe the accumulation of all those positive things that you've achieved at the end of your lives will mean a hell of a lot more than being Warren Buffett. I think that will definitely be the case. So I have a moral at the end of this really quickly, because I've gone over time, which is that, you know, the Medal of Honor was the ultimate accolade for an infantryman in World War II liberating Europe or in the Pacific. But I think that the greatest gift that these veterans that came home felt that they had received was the experience of fighting beside other Americans, that they felt tied to other Americans in a way that they never would again in their life. And they felt a sense of patriotism, which wasn't about so much flag waving, it was about loving their fellow Americans, understanding them, uniting, working as a group towards something that was a noble mission. And I think that it was very hard for them to find that sense of purpose again. They were traumatized. Any kind of combat will traumatize you. It depends on how you deal with it. None of these men put the war behind them. They put it beside them. And when we talk about the greatest generation, just to finish up, I think it's important to understand that not only were they great because they survived the Great Depression and they fought to liberate Europe and those who were oppressed by the Japanese in the Pacific, but they came home and then they overcame the trauma, the damage that had been done to them. And that battle, that constant challenge to overcome what has been done to you, to overcome the fact that you've become, in some ways, a monster, to heal in whatever way you can the moral injury that has been done to you by becoming a killer, by seeing people you love killed beside you. The deep moral injury that all war involves. To overcome that, to heal it in any way, is a very heroic thing, and something that I think makes the greatest generation even greater. That moral injury is profound. And I thought your presentation and yours were particularly moving, because there you have examples of people overcoming moral injury. They were put in positions that they never wanted to be in. They were given guns, they were given weapons, and they used them. And yet in that process, they injured themselves on a profound level, and others in a physical level, but themselves they injured spiritually and psychologically and emotionally. And for them to have the strength and the ability to be able to heal in some way what had been done is a wonderful, wonderful thing. So thank you very much for listening, and